She went to the doctor about a small spot on her nose. That is how these stories sometimes begin, not with drama, not with a cascade of warning signs that were ignored, not with the kind of narrative arc that fiction would require for credibility, but with the ordinary, almost trivially motivated visit to a medical professional about something that seemed in the beginning like very little. A small mark, a minor blemish, something that a 20-year-old with a face that has been professionally photographed and carefully maintained since before she started kindergarten might have had looked at simply as a matter of professional maintenance. The diagnosis was not minor: malignant melanoma, one of the most serious forms of skin cancer, the type that carries the highest mortality rate among dermatological malignancies, the type that can spread from a single site to the lymph nodes and then to distant organs with a speed that makes early detection not merely important, but potentially the difference between a scare and a catastrophe. If it had progressed further, Marsai Martin told the magazine that heard her story, it could have affected my eye, and I would have lost my eye. That was genuinely terrifying. She described the surgeries, multiple operations to remove affected tissue from her face, painful procedures that required a young woman who had been performing in front of cameras since she was 5 years old to undergo interventions that leave their marks, that require recovery time, that put the professional life on hold while the biological one demands immediate attention. She described the fear. She was honest about how frightening it had been, and then she said what she always says in one form or another, because it is the organizing principle of a life that has been extraordinary in ways that have very little to do with the famous role or the production credits or any of the other formal markers of achievement that her career has generated. She emphasized mental health, the importance of staying connected, of saying out loud what you are feeling, of maintaining the relationships with family and friends that keep you grounded in who you are, rather than what you produce. This is Marsai Martin, 20 years old, veteran of a decade and a half of professional performance, the youngest executive producer in Hollywood history melanoma survivor, and one of the more thoughtful voices in American entertainment about what it actually costs to grow up inside an industry that is not designed for the well-being of the people it profits from. To understand what this moment means in the context of her life, it is necessary to understand the full story, which begins not in Los Angeles, not in a studio, but in Plano, Texas, with a child who could not sit still, and parents who understood that this was not a problem to be managed, but a gift to be cultivated. Marsai Monique Martin was born on August 14, 2004 in Plano, Texas, a suburban city north of Dallas that has produced across its relatively brief history as one of the fastest-growing cities in America, a disproportionate share of people who have gone on to significant careers in entertainment business and the arts. Plano is not Hollywood. It is not New York. It is a place of quiet suburban ambition of families who moved there for the schools and the safety and the space, and whose children have sometimes taken the advantages of that environment and pointed them in directions their parents did not necessarily anticipate. Her parents, Joshua and Carol Martin, recognized very early that their daughter was not an ordinary child in the specific sense that matters for an entertainment career. She had something that the cameras could see. Not simply that she was photogenic, though she was. Marsai Martin's face has always had a quality of expressiveness and specificity that makes it immediately compelling on screen. But more than that, she had the intangible quality of genuine presence, the ability to hold space, to communicate, to make an audience feel her existence in a way that cannot be taught, and that very few children possess. She began performing in commercials at age 5. This is in the world of child entertainment, a relatively common starting point. The commercial audition circuit is a training ground for thousands of young performers, most of whom will not go beyond it, and it provides a specific kind of professional education that no acting class fully replicates. The experience of being on a real set with real cameras and real crew and real stakes, doing real work and being expected to deliver results. Marsai Martin delivered results. From her first commercial appearances, it was clear that she was not merely executing instructions, but actually performing, making choices, bringing something to the work that exceeded the technical requirements of the task. The directors noticed, the casting agents noticed, and eventually the family made the decision that such recognitions in such volume eventually force they moved to Los Angeles. Marsai was 5 years old when they began the commercial work. She was not yet 10 when the family's commitment to her career had redirected the entire trajectory of their lives. This is the specific disruption that genuine child talent in entertainment produces, not just the child's life, but the family's. Reshaped around the requirements and the possibilities of a gift that the industry is always ready to exploit, and that parents must navigate with great care if it is to be used well, rather than simply used up. In 2014, Kenya Barris created Black-ish, a sitcom for ABC that centered on the Johnson family, an upper-middle-class black family in Los Angeles, navigating questions of identity, race, class, and the specific tensions of success within a system that was not always designed to accommodate them. The show was, from its first episode, something more than its premise suggested, not simply a family comedy, but a genuinely engaged cultural critique, a weekly examination of what it means to be black and wealthy, and raising children in contemporary America, delivered through the specific lens of a family whose dynamics were drawn with enough specificity and enough affection to make the broader arguments feel human rather than schematic. The family required children, and Black-ish required children who could hold their own alongside Anthony Anderson and Tracy Ellis Ross, two actors of enormous skill and charisma who had between them enough television presence to overwhelm less confident young performers. The show required children who could be funny, who could be emotionally real, who could participate in scenes that had genuine satirical and dramatic content without being merely decorative. Marsai Martin was cast as Diane Johnson, one of the youngest of the Johnson children, and in narrative terms, the sibling whose specific combination of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness served as the show's most openly comic version of the theme that Black excellence sometimes produces children who are terrifying in their competence and focus. The performance that resulted was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more remarkable things that American network television has produced in terms of child acting. Marsai Martin did not merely hold her own against Anderson and Ross. She added to scenes. She generated genuine comedic chemistry with performers 3 and 4 times her age. She found in Diane Johnson a specificity of character that made the role feel inhabited rather than performed. She was not a child doing a good impression of acting. She was acting. The show was immediately successful, critically praised, commercially competitive, and culturally significant in ways that went beyond the typical sitcom discourse. It won the Peabody Award. It was cited by cultural critics as one of the most important programs of its decade. It ran for 8 seasons, from 2014 to 2022, and produced multiple spin-off series, including Grownish, Mixedish, and Oldish. Marsai Martin was in it from the beginning, growing up in the role across 8 years of production in a way that very few actors of any age experience, the specific evolution of inhabiting a character, while simultaneously inhabiting the more fundamental transformation of growing from a 9-year-old child into a young adult. In April 2019, Universal Pictures released Little, a body swap comedy in which a tyrannical tech mogul played by Regina Hall wakes up one morning in the body of her 13-year-old self, played by Marsai Martin. The film was a mainstream Hollywood production, competently made and reasonably well received, and it would have been a notable credit for a young actress building a career. But Little was not for Marsai Martin simply an acting credit. She had been 14 years old when she pitched the concept. She had been in a development meeting, the kind of meeting that adult executives attend, with decades of industry experience and institutional backing, and she had proposed the idea that became the film. She had then been given the producer credit, not as a courtesy, but as a recognition of genuine creative contribution to a project that would not have existed without her. The credit made history. At 14 years old, Marsai Martin became the youngest executive producer of a major Hollywood film in the history of the industry. The record was noted, documented, and celebrated, but the record is in some ways less interesting than what it represents, which is not a precocious child being allowed to put a title on a project she was tangentially involved in, but a teenager who had grown up inside the creative machinery of professional television and had absorbed, over the course of nearly a decade of professional work, an understanding of how stories are developed and produced that most industry professionals take considerably longer to acquire. She had been watching. She had been learning. She had been, from the early days of Blackish, paying attention not just to the performance work that was her primary responsibility, but to the production process that surrounded it, to how decisions were made, how budgets worked, how creative visions were translated into commercial products, how the power in a room was distributed, and how it could be redirected. And when she had an idea that she thought was good enough to be a movie, she went to the meeting and said so. And she was right. The achievement received enormous coverage. Not just entertainment coverage, but business coverage, cultural coverage in publications that do not typically concern themselves with Hollywood production credits, but that understood that what Marsai Martin had done was something genuinely significant. She had broken a barrier that was not simply about age, but about the specific kind of authority and creative agency that young Black women in Hollywood are not typically extended. She had been given it because she had earned it. And she had earned it by doing the work, by being present, attentive, and genuinely engaged with the creative and business dimensions of the industry from the time she was old enough to form opinions about them. The question of what it costs to grow up inside the entertainment industry, to have your childhood and adolescence be simultaneously your professional career, and the material from which your public identity is constructed, is one of the more important and least adequately addressed questions in the discourse around child performers. The industry has an extensive history of child stars who have emerged from it damaged not always visibly, not always immediately, but in patterns that are consistent enough to constitute a recognizable phenomenon. The pressures of professional performance, which require an adult's level of discipline and focus and emotional availability applied to children who are simultaneously attempting to navigate the ordinary developmental challenges of growing up. The financial dimensions, which make the child's continued employability a matter of family economics in ways that can distort the parent-child relationship in subtle but consequential ways. The specific social isolation of a life spent primarily among adult professionals rather than peers. The absence of the ordinary contexts of childhood, the unstructured play, the low-stakes relationships, the permission to fail privately that appear from the evidence of developmental psychology to be necessary for healthy psychological development. Marsai Martin has spoken about all of this with a directness and a sophistication that reflects both genuine self-awareness and the specific benefit of having parents who took the psychological dimensions of her situation seriously from the beginning. She has spoken about the importance of mental health not as an abstract cause she champions, but as a specific personal practice that she has maintained across the years of professional work, an ongoing effort to stay connected to herself as a person rather than simply as a performer. She emphasizes communication, the importance of saying what you are feeling, rather than performing wellness for the benefit of an industry that profits from your productivity and is not always structured to care about your interior life. She emphasizes the relationships with family and friends that exist outside the professional context, the people for whom she is Marsai, rather than a credit whose love is not contingent on the next project's performance. She has also spoken with characteristic honesty about the specific challenges of being a young Black woman in Hollywood, an industry that has made real progress in representation in recent years, but that still contains the specific biases and specific limited imaginations that have historically constrained what kinds of stories are told about and by Black women, and who is given the creative authority to tell them. Her advocacy for mental health in the creative community is not separate from her professional work. It is the same work approached from a different angle. The same understanding that produced the little executive producer credit the understanding that the person with the most at stake should have the most say applies to the advocacy as well. The people most affected by the mental health costs of the entertainment industry are the ones best positioned to say clearly what those costs are and to demand that the industry develop better responses to them. The visit to the doctor was as such visits often are motivated not by fear but by something much more ordinary. There was a mark on her nose. It needed to be looked at. She went. Malignant melanoma is the most dangerous form of skin cancer responsible for the majority of skin cancer deaths, despite accounting for a minority of skin cancer diagnoses. It arises from the melanocytes, the cells responsible for producing the pigment that gives skin its color, and it can develop from existing moles or from apparently normal skin. Its early detection is critical. Melanoma caught at its earliest stage has a survival rate above 95%. Melanoma that has spread to distant organs has a survival rate below 30%. The interval between early and spread can be alarmingly brief. Marsai Martin's cancer was caught. This is the most important sentence in the medical narrative of her situation, and it is a sentence whose significance cannot be overstated. She went to a doctor about something small. The doctor looked at it carefully, did the necessary investigation, and found something that required immediate and serious attention. Multiple surgeries were performed to remove affected tissue from her face. The margins were checked and rechecked, and the cancer had not spread. The eye, which would have been at risk if the cancer had progressed, was spared. She described the fear with honesty that did not minimize it. The prospect of losing an eye is not abstract for a 20-year-old actress whose face is one of her professional instruments, whose expressions and reactions are the primary medium through which she communicates her craft. But it is also not abstract for a 20-year-old human being who uses her eyes to see the world, to read, to drive, to recognize the faces of the people she loves, to experience the visual dimension of being alive. The fear she described was the fear of real loss, named plainly and without theatrical amplification. The surgeries were painful. The recovery required time. The professional life, which runs on availability and visibility, and the constant maintenance of presence in an industry that does not pause for anyone's medical needs, had to accommodate the biological reality that her body was presenting. She accommodated it. She did what she always does. She was honest about what was happening. She maintained her connections to the people who ground her. She processed the experience rather than suppressing it. And she came out the other side with the specific knowledge that early detection had saved her from something much worse. There is a specific public health dimension to Marsai Martin's melanoma story that she appears to understand, and that her willingness to speak about her diagnosis serves directly. Melanoma in people with darker skin tones is consistently diagnosed later and at more advanced stages than in people with lighter skin with correspondingly worse outcomes. This disparity is the product of multiple factors. There is a persistent cultural assumption widespread in the general public and not absent among medical professionals that skin cancer primarily affects people with fair skin and that darker-skinned individuals are at lower risk. While it is true that melanin provides some degree of protection against ultraviolet radiation-induced DNA damage, it does not provide complete protection, and the assumption of protection can cause dark-skinned people to be less vigilant about sun protection and less likely to seek medical attention for skin changes that they or their doctors attribute to normal variation. The result is that when melanoma is diagnosed in Black, Latino, In Asian patients, it tends to be diagnosed at a more advanced stage when treatment is more difficult and prognosis is worse. The survival rate disparity between white and black patients with melanoma is substantial and is attributable primarily to this delay in diagnosis rather than to any biological difference in the cancer itself. Marsai Martin's story, a young black woman who went to a doctor about something small, received an early diagnosis, and had the cancer treated before it could spread, is a public health message of the highest order. Not because she chose to make it one, but because the specificity of her experience illustrates exactly what the public health researchers who study these disparities are trying to communicate: that early presentation matters, that something that seems small might not be, and that the assumptions that lead dark-skinned people to delay medical evaluation of skin changes are assumptions that cost lives. She has spoken about this with the awareness of someone who understands that her story has a larger dimension, that she is not simply a young woman who had something frightening happen to her and survived it, but a young woman with a platform and an audience, and the specific kind of credibility that comes from lived experience, who can use all of these things to say something that might save someone else's skin, literally. As Blackish continued into its later seasons, Marsai Martin's character Diane Johnson evolved alongside her, the precocious, slightly terrifying child, growing into a precocious, slightly terrifying teenager, the arc of the character reflecting in miniature the arc of the actress. The role gave her over 8 years an extraordinary range of material to work with comedy drama, the specific comedic dramatic hybrid that sitcom at its best produces, and the opportunity to develop technical skills across a span of time that most actors do not experience in a single sustained project. She also developed a following that was from early on something more than the ordinary fan relationship that successful television creates. Young black girls in particular responded to Diane Johnson and to Marsai Martin with a specific intensity of identification that spoke to something that the character and the actress behind it represented for them. Here was a young black girl who was smart and ambitious and unapologetically herself in a mainstream television context, in a role that did not require her to be anybody's sidekick or to limit her personality to what the broader culture found comfortable. The representation mattered. It mattered in the immediate and practical sense that young people who see themselves reflected in the characters they watch on television receive a specific kind of permission, the permission to be fully themselves, to be as ambitious and as complicated and as present as the characters they love. And it mattered in the longer-term sense that the culture changes incrementally through exactly these kinds of representations, through the accumulation of images that expand rather than contract the range of what young black girls are understood to be capable of. Marsai Martin understood this responsibility and took it seriously, not in the way that produces performed consciousness, but in the way that produces genuine thoughtfulness about the choices you make and the platform you use them from. Following the success of Little Marsai, Marsai Martin did not simply add a production credit to her resume and move on. She built a company. Genius Entertainment is her production venture, the institutional infrastructure for a creative vision that extends beyond any single project that is positioned to develop content across multiple formats and over a period of years, rather than simply reacting to opportunities as they arise. The company is in its conception and its early operations evidence of the same quality that produced the little pitch, the ability to think strategically about the creative and commercial dimensions of the entertainment business, simultaneously to understand that content development requires institutional support rather than simply individual talent, and to build that support from a position of creative and financial leverage that she has earned through her performing career rather than borrowed from someone else's. This is in the context of the entertainment industry's history, with young black women in particular genuinely significant. The industry has a long pattern of extracting value from black talent while retaining the ownership structures and the institutional power that allow that extraction to continue. Marsai Martin is consciously and deliberately building a different relationship to those structures, not simply participating in them as a performer, but owning pieces of the infrastructure through which content is developed and produced. She is 20 years old. She has a production company. She has a track record of executive production that includes a major studio release. She has nearly a decade and a half of professional experience across commercial work series, television, and film. She has survived a melanoma diagnosis and used the experience to contribute to a public health conversation. She has maintained through all of this a commitment to her own mental health and to the relationships that keep her grounded. The long game in Marsai Martin's case is already well advanced. When Marsai Martin speaks about mental health, about the importance of voicing your feelings, maintaining close relationships, staying connected to who you are beyond your professional identity, she is not speaking from a position of general wellness advocacy. She is speaking from the specific experience of a person who has spent the majority of her conscious life inside an industry that creates particular and well-documented psychological pressures, who has navigated those pressures since the age of 5, and who has made a deliberate and sustained choice to address them directly rather than simply hoping that youth and talent and career momentum will be sufficient insulation. The entertainment industry's relationship with mental health has evolved significantly over the past decade. The conversations initiated by performers who have been willing to disclose their own struggles, the growing acceptance of the idea that psychological well-being is a professional matter as well as a personal one, the slow development of institutional resources and norms that make it possible for people working in the industry to acknowledge difficulty without fearing that the acknowledgement will cost them work. But the evolution has been uneven, and the specific pressures on young performers have not yet been adequately addressed. The child actor experience remains largely unregulated in ways that create real risks for children who are economically and institutionally dependent on the goodwill of adults whose primary interest is in their professional value. The psychological support structures that professional sports, another industry that relies heavily on the gifts of young people, have developed over decades, are not yet standard in the entertainment industry. Marsai Martin's advocacy exists in this context. She is not simply encouraging other young people to practice self-care in a general sense. She is pointing at something specific, the necessity of having relationships and practices that exist outside the professional context, that do not depend on your continued professional success, that provide the grounding and the honest feedback that the entertainment environment cannot and will not provide. She talks about her family in this context not as a generic expression of gratitude, but as a specific description of people who knew her before she was an industry credit and who continue to know her as a person rather than a career. The value of this cannot be overstated for someone whose professional identity has been public and visible and commercially evaluated since the age of 5. She talks about her friends, the relationships that exist on the basis of genuine mutual affection rather than professional alignment, that provide the specific kind of honesty and normalcy that professional relationships cannot fully substitute for. In an industry that routinely isolates its most successful participants within a circle of professional relationships, the cultivation and maintenance of genuine friendship is itself a form of resistance. At 20 years old, Marsai Martin has more professional experience than most actors accumulate in a full career. She has the perspective that comes from having been inside the machinery since before she formed her earliest memories of it, from having grown up watching how things work, absorbing the lessons that the industry teaches through both its successes and its failures, and having parents who created enough protective space around her that the absorption was productive rather than simply damaging. She has spoken about what she wants her career to be with a specificity and a thoughtfulness that is unusual at any age and remarkable at 20. She wants to tell stories that matter. She wants the stories she tells to be created through institutions that she owns and controls, so that the full value of the work accrues to her and to the people she chooses to build with, rather than to the structural beneficiaries of the industry's existing power arrangements. She wants to use her platform for things that are genuinely useful: the mental health advocacy, the public health contribution of her melanoma disclosure, the representation that her presence in mainstream television has provided for young Black girls who needed to see themselves there. She also wants to grow. This is perhaps the most fundamental thing about Marsai Martin at 20, the thing that makes her story different from the stories of so many child performers who arrived at early success and were subsequently unable to develop because the industry's image of them was fixed at the moment of their greatest commercial visibility. She is explicitly, deliberately committed to growth, to the exploration of roles and formats and creative contexts that are different from what she has done, to the development of skills and perspectives that her current experience has not yet provided. The melanoma scare has, by her account, contributed to this orientation. Facing the possibility of serious physical harm, of losing an eye, of having cancer spread to parts of the body that cannot be surgically addressed, has the specific effect that genuine confrontations with mortality tend to have. It clarifies priorities, reduces the proportion of attention devoted to things that don't ultimately matter, and increases the urgency of doing the things that do. She wants the adventures that remain. She wants the creative work, the stories told, and the stories producing the advocacy and the growth and the continued development of the production company that will eventually produce things she cannot yet imagine. She wants the relationships with family, with friends, with the collaborators who will help her build what she is building to continue and deepen. And she wants, above all, to remain herself, not the character, not the credit, not the youngest executive producer in Hollywood history, but the person who started performing commercials at 5 years old in Plano, Texas, because she had something to say and the talent to say it, and who has been saying it in every format available ever since. It would be easy and somewhat dishonest to frame Marsai Martin's story entirely as a triumph, the prodigy who got everything right, who navigated the treacherous landscape of child stardom without the damage that the landscape usually produces, who added achievement to achievement with the smoothness of someone for whom talent and ambition and circumstance aligned perfectly. The truth is more complicated and more interesting. She has been in an industry that extracts enormous value from the people who work within it, and she has navigated that extraction with more sophistication than most adults manage. But the navigation has had costs. The melanoma was the body's way of presenting a bill for years of professional maintenance in an industry whose standards for appearance require sustained exposure to the kinds of treatments and conditions that have consequences. The psychological costs are harder to measure and harder to discuss, but she has been honest about them, about the necessity of the mental health work, about the importance of the relationships outside the professional context, about the ongoing effort required to remain a person rather than simply a performer. She has also had throughout her career the specific kind of support that makes the difference between child stardom as a developmental catastrophe and child stardom as an unusual but survivable education. Her parents have been with her consistently and intelligently in a way that the stories of child performers who did not fare as well consistently lack. This is not luck. It is the product of Joshua and Carol Martin's choices about how to manage their daughter's extraordinary circumstances, and it is the most important factor in the account of how she got from 5 years old in a commercial to 20 years old as a melanoma survivor and production company owner with an intact sense of self. She went to the doctor about a spot on her nose. The spot turned out to be cancer. The cancer was caught early because she went. She had multiple surgeries. She did not lose her eye. She is 20 years old, and she is well. And she is talking about it because she believes with the characteristic directness of a person who has been being honest with large audiences since she was a child, that talking about it might help someone else. This is the complete arc of the medical story. It is not long. It does not require elaboration. Its significance lies entirely in its outcome, which is that a young woman who had every reason to dismiss a small spot on her nose as cosmetic noise chose instead to have it looked at, and the choice saved her from a much longer and much more difficult story. The professional story is longer and more elaborate, and it is not finished. The production company is building. The roles ahead are unknown but available. The advocacy work continues. The family and friends who keep her grounded are still there, still in the positions that allow them to do what they do for her. She is 20 years old, and she has already done more than most people do in a full career. She knows it. She is not using it as an excuse to slow down. The stage is still set. The cameras are still running. And Marsai Martin, the girl from Plano, Texas, who could not sit still, whose parents recognized something in her, who grew up on a sitcom and produced a movie and survived cancer and built a company, is still in the most important sense just getting started.